So this is the last thing that we're going to cover in Unit 2 before that you switch into reviewing for your test coming up on Friday. So we're going to be looking at some of the other diversity in the colonies, specifically in the aspects of politics, economics, and religion, which is how we're going to tie in the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening. So just keep in mind, as we've already talked about, that even though there are 13 colonies and they're in North America, that these are British colonies. And so there's a lot of British patriotism amongst the people who live in the colonies. I know some people asked in the questions that you had for mercantilism last week, why don't the colonists revolt or do something against the British? But keep in mind that the colonists felt that they were British. They shared the same law that people in England had. They spoke the same language. All of them were Protestant. All of them hated the French. And so the people who are in the colonies are British colonists. They are part of the British Empire. And there is a lot of pride and nationalism for Britain because Britain really is the world power at this point. It's one of the most advanced and the freest nations in the world. So there wasn't a lot of conflict from their colonies to begin with. And what we're going to see today is how some of that animosity starts to develop, and we know it will continue to grow as the British start taxing the colonists more after the French and Indian War. All right, so the rights of Englishmen. So central to British identity was the idea of liberty. And you guys learned about the Glorious Revolution and how the English Bill of Rights came into play. And so what happens is the people in the colonies are taking those same ideas about liberty and rights and they're applying it to themselves. And so they'll start to see a national characteristic that develops about British identity. And British people also believed that no man, not even the king, was above the law. And this is something that we're going to see like Thomas Jefferson interject when he writes the Declaration of Independence and things like that. So in some sense, as colonists start to revolt against the British, they feel like they're invoking the rights that they had as Englishmen to do so. So the leading philosopher of liberty during this time period is a man named John Locke, and you probably remember John Locke from world history. John Locke is one of the main leaders of the Enlightenment, and some of Locke's major ideas included ideas such as individual rights, so the rights that we see in the English Bill of Rights, the rights that we see in the American Bill of Rights, things like freedom of religion, and things like that would be individual rights. He believed in the consent of the governed. So a ruler is only in power because they have the consent of the people that they're governing, and the right of rebellions against unjust or oppressive governments. So Locke felt like if your government was unjust or if your government was oppressive, it was the right of the people to alter or to abolish that government and to create a new government that wasn't unjust and that wasn't oppressive. And we're going to see Jefferson use this language in the Declaration of Independence as reasoning for rebelling against the British government. So the Enlightenment starts in Europe and it starts to trickle over to the American colonies. Americans are going to apply Enlightenment ideals to their political and their social life. The Enlightenment, remember, also happens around the same time as the scientific revolution. And so there's all of these ideas about investigating things and researching and learning. And so the social contract is one of the big things that comes out of the Enlightenment. Again, the social contract was a Lockean idea that the contract was between the government and the people. And as part of the contract or as part of the agreement, the people gave up some of their rights, and in exchange, it was the government's job to protect them. But if a government was failing to do its job, if a government was not protecting its citizens, then those citizens had the right to overthrow their government. And we're going to see this idea of the social contract. We'll see this happen through the Declaration of Independence. We also see ideas like deism and natural laws that become part of the American Enlightenment. Natural laws, according to John Locke, were things like life, liberty, and property. We'll see Jefferson change that to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Natural laws were laws that were given by God to every human being. It didn't matter what country you were born in, these were natural rights that everyone had. Deists were people who, somewhat like Christianity, they saw a creator, so they saw God as the creator, but then after creation, he became a hands-off God, and so he didn't really concern himself with what was happening in the everyday lives of people. People like Thomas Jefferson, as well as some of the other founders, were deists, like Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin will be one of the main leaders of the American Enlightenment in the colonies. So here's Benjamin Franklin, here's Thomas Jefferson. So the Enlightenment is going to stress the use of reason and the scientific method. We know that one of the main leaders, again, in England was John Locke. I just mentioned natural rights and the social contract. And so you can see in this meme here, one does not simply take away someone's natural rights. So natural rights were extremely important during the Enlightenment, because what the colonists start to say is, you know, it doesn't matter if we're British colonists and we don't live in England, that we are entitled to the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And we feel like our government is taking away our liberty and our property, and therefore our life, through things such as the Navigation Act, through things like the Tea Act and the Sugar Act and all of those things that come later that we'll see play into the American Revolution. So as people are starting to use reason and the scientific method and think about the social contract and what happens between a people and its government, we start to see that American identity start to emerge as people are thinking about how the government is treating them, and if the government's doing its job. And if it's not, what are the alternatives to that? So this also plays into things like the right to vote. We already know that owning property was a qualifier for voting in the colonies. You had to own property in order to vote. Even though there was property requirements for voting, suffrage, which means voting, was much more common in the colonies than in Britain. So it was much easier to be able to own land and therefore be able to vote in the colonies than it was to do so in England. There were also property qualifications for being able to hold office, for being a politician. And if you were going to hold office, if you were going to be in the House of Burgesses or something like that, you had to have even more property than you had to have in order to just vote. And so again, that we can see that landed elites are going to be the people that are not only controlling the economy, but also the government in the colonies. So colonial governments, we know that during the first half of the 18th century, the colonies were largely left to govern themselves. This is what we call salutary neglect. And so what happens is Britain is busy doing things in Europe, the colonists will actually have elected assemblies like the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and those elected assemblies will have a lot of influence in the colonies. So we have appointed officials that are appointed from England, like governors, but then you also have elected assemblies that were in charge of making laws, and those elected assemblies became a lot more powerful. So again, we're going to see the assemblies becoming dominant during the 18th century, especially in colonies like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, as well as South Carolina. And this all ties into salutary neglect, which is where England was having very loose supervision of their colonies, as England was becoming more occupied with other overseas colonies and with some of its imperial rivalries with places like France. They were kind of neglecting supervising their colonies. They're also dealing with internal problems that were going on, like the Glorious Revolution that happened in 1688, where Parliament became more powerful than the monarchy. And when Parliament became more powerful, it opened up more power for elected assemblies in the colonies. So you can see here, I wear my sunglasses, so I can't see what those colonists over in America are up to, but that's going to change. when England starts to go back on its policy of salutary neglect after the French and Indian War, we're going to see that American colonists are not happy about this. They had gotten very used to governing themselves, and so when the British start to end this policy of salutary neglect, again, we'll see some beginnings of revolution start to develop. So we know that the American gentry is very active in the discussion of politics, gentry being your upper class citizens, of course, only men. There was widespread literacy in the colonies. There was also a lot of newspapers that encouraged political discussion. And so we can see that Enlightenment ideas are being spread in the colonies, and this is going to start forming American identity. There were limits to freedom of expression. So freedom of speech, keep in mind, was a relatively new idea. It had been outlined in the English Bill of Rights in the late 1680s, as well as freedom of press. So because these were new ideas, a lot of times they were viewed with skepticism, and sometimes they were viewed as dangerous. So after 1695, the government could not censor print material, and colonial newspapers defended freedom of the press as a central component of liberty. And we can see that even though this is starting very early in 1695, freedom of press and freedom of speech will be included in the Bill of Rights, and that gets added on to the Constitution almost 100 years later. So this leads us to the trial of Zenger, which is one of your anchor points that you did. So John Peter Zenger went on trial in 1735 for seditious libel, which means that he was accused of publishing false information, but not just false information, but false information that attacked someone. He was found not guilty, and the outcome promoted the ideas that the truth should always be permitted and that free expression ought to be allowed. Now, it says that the truth should be permitted. That didn't mean that there was complete freedom of the press. You can't just publish blatant lies, but the truth should always be permitted and protected. And we'll see this idea of freedom of the press that comes out of the trial of Zenger. Again, that will become part of American national identity that gets incorporated into the Bill of Rights. So switching from politics, we can see how the Enlightenment kind of helps to start forming American identity, but religion does the same thing. So the Great Awakening is a series of religious revivals. This is a religious movement. This is the first Great Awakening. There will be a second one in the mid-1800s. It's actually larger in scale that we'll talk about, but this is the first one. And basically what it does is it's going to help unite the colonists under the banner of Christianity. The First Great Awakening is going to offer a more emotional and personal experience with Christianity, and what we'll see is that this is going to help unite the colonists. One of the main leaders was a flamboyant preacher named Jonathan Edwards. He wrote a very famous sermon that he delivered called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And Jonathan Edwards came out of the Puritan faith tradition that we've learned about, the Puritans who settled the Massachusetts Bay colonists. And remember from the very beginning that Massachusetts had been a leader of education. Remember that the Puritans wanted everyone in their colony to be able to read so that they could read the Bible. And so what we're going to see with the First Great Awakening, it's not only uniting colonists under the banner of Christianity, but it's increasing the education levels in the colonies. And education is power. As people are becoming more educated and they're able to read newspapers and understand ideas about the Enlightenment and what's happening in politics, we're going to see them questioning British authority and start to think as more of an American identity. We're also going to see the establishment of universities during the First Great Awakening, like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. And then, of course, I mentioned Jonathan Edwards. Here is a quote from his famous sermon. He says, "The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire." So you can see that Edwards is trying to convince people that they need to repent of their sins and be saved. If not, they would end up in hell. So the Great Awakening is really kind of sparked by a man named George Whitefield. He was an English minister And he believed that God was merciful, that God didn't want to cast people into the fire. That's why he was seeking to get people to repent. And so Whitefield is one of the main leaders of the Awakening, and you'll read an excerpt from him as well. So the Great Awakening enlarged the boundaries of liberty as people started to think more about freedom. And it's going to inspire criticism of a lot of the aspects of colonial society. A few preachers will actually explicitly condemn slavery. Unfortunately, a lot of preachers somehow managed to reconcile Christianity and slaveholding and say they're not at odds with one another. So the Great Awakening, like I said before, expanded the circulation of printed material in the colonies, and more people are reading, more people are understanding ideas, and more people are going to start criticizing the British government. So our main question that we want to look at today and think about is how the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening helped create an American national identity. And hopefully you can see some of the ways that I tried to answer that as I was going through some of the information in this presentation. To help you answer that question, I have put some primary sources that you're going to look at. The first one is from John Locke. It's an excerpt from the Second Treatise of Civil Government. The italicized part here is a little introduction to John Locke and to this source. There's an excerpt from the source, and you're going to HIP it. And so remember, HIP, historical context, intended audience, point of view, and purpose. Remember, for point of view, you can't just say John Locke, but you have to give me some information about who John Locke was. The other source you have, this one is from George Whitefield. It's about George Whitefield. It's actually written by Benjamin Franklin about George Whitefield. And so you'll get some more information about Franklin and Whitefield, who were leaders of the Enlightenment and the Awakening, and you're going to HIP that one. And then this is an excerpt from Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and you're going to HIP it as well. And then at the end, you have the prompt here. So we're still practicing thesis statements. The prompt, very similar to the essential question. You want to evaluate the extent to which the Enlightenment and First Great Awakening created an American national identity. And you're going to answer that in a thesis statement. A couple of things to remember about thesis statements. A thesis statement normally has 3 parts. So you can think about 3 ways that the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening helped to create an American national identity. The thesis statement is typically 1 to 2 sentences, no more than 2 sentences, and your thesis statement answers the prompt, meaning that when you answer the prompt, you'll say something like, the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening helped create an American national identity by, and then you can list the ways that that national identity was created. So remember, the thesis answers the prompt. It's 1 to 2 sentences, and it typically has 2 to 3 reasons that help answer the prompt. Great, so that's what you're going to turn in for this assignment. If you have questions, let me know.